Tēnā koutou, mai haramai te nei o tēnei hiri. Pai ana te tūtaki kia koutou katoa. Anei Tony Simpson, ko Nīkau Wi Neera tōku ingoa. Welcome everybody. It is welcome to see everyone. It is wonderful to see everyone. We have the privilege tonight of being addressed by Tony Simpson. Prior to the very illustrious introduction which I'm about to give him, I'm under strict orders to give some shout-outs. The first shout-out I would like to give is, of course, to the Rogue and to Bedlam Squalor for having us here. Thank you very much for providing the bar staff, for the space, and for the tireless support which you fellas show to the society. So can we give them just a quick little love? Secondly, if you are new here or if you're not quite sure who's hosting this gig at the moment, you are in the loving arms of the Wellington Socialist Society, which is a member of the Federation of Socialist Societies. There are a bunch of great pamphlets all over these tables if you're not too sure what socialism is about, in plain old English as well, which is rare for socialists. I'm also under strict instructions to give a shout out to this event, for which you can also find flyers strewn haphazardly about the place. This is the Ernie Abbott Memorial Theatre. Old Ernie was the cleaner and caretaker at the Wellington Trades Hall, which is just over a couple blocks from here, which used to be, and to some degree still is, the heart of the working class movement in Te Whanganui-a-Tara in Wellington. So he was tragically killed at the height of the union struggle in this city, in this country, and there will be on the 27th of this month a memorial lecture in remembrance of him. That will start at 4:30. That's over at the Trades Hall on Vivian Street. That's 126 Vivian. So yeah, 27th of March. Lock that in your calendars. Right, so today, this evening rather, we are here to hear from Tony Simpson. So Tony was born up in Rangiora, or down in Rangiora actually, which is in North Canterbury. This gentleman is the author of some 20 published books, yeah. The first of which was hilariously entitled The Sugarbag Years, which was a history of the Depression, which was less cheerful, of the 30s, and which won widespread acclaim. Some other of his works have included Te Pākehā, which was a compelling account of how Māori were dispossessed of most of our land between the years 1840 and 1970. And finally, For Hobson, which you can see up here, small plug on that, more on that later, which is a political and economic background to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, partially which we're going to cover tonight. He's worked over the years in a million jobs: journalist, writer, producer, television, busybody extraordinaire, union man all his life, but most recently as a senior policy advisor to Cabinet Minister Jim Anderton before he retired in 2011. Tony now writes full-time, as you can see, very busy, and runs a small publishing company, the Bloodswood Press in Wellington. He is a past president of the New Zealand Society of Authors, and in 2005 was awarded the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to historical research. So without further ado, I'd like to invite him to address us tonight. He will be speaking about some of the whakapapa of the treaty, some context around it, and the introduction of colonial capitalism to this country, which is all very interesting stuff, very topical, very pertinent. So yeah, I'd like you all to join me in giving a very welcome to Tony Simpson.
Well, kia ora tātou, and thank you for that welcome. I want to begin with a disclaimer, actually. For some reason, although I've been studying the treaty now for about 40 years, off and on, whenever I speak on it, which is from time to time, there's always a few people in the audience who think, for no good reason, that I don't think we should be honouring it. And they couldn't be more wrong. I'm 100% in favour of that. And I think that the ACT Party are a bunch of dingbats, and that David Seymour is a wicked, cynical man who manipulates people's political beliefs for his own ends. So let's be quite clear about that. Okay. Now, if we're going to understand the Treaty of Waitangi, the first thing you have to do is actually to invent it. If you don't know how history is written, that probably sounds a bit weird, so let me explain it to you. History writing exists at two levels. There's a straightforward narrative of facts and events in a time sequence, the purpose of which is to help people understand what happened in the past. That's what non-historians mean when they use the word history. But beyond that, there's always a meta-narrative which frames the first narrative by setting criteria for the selection of the facts relevant to the understanding of the past and to establish their meaning. Meta-narratives are identified under a range of names. The social philosopher Thomas Kuhn, for example, calls them paradigms. You may have heard that expression used. The cultural Marxist Antonio Gramsci calls them hegemonia, which roughly translates as hegemonies. There are other names too, but they're all referring to pretty much the same thing. They're the usually unarticulated premises on which any history you're reading is predicated, and they usually reflect the perspective of the dominant groups within the society. If you're aware of them, then you know to read history with a critical eye and can ask yourself, whose history is it that I am reading? As far as the treaty is concerned, the traditional framework under which it is understood is that of a benevolent government in London, assisted by the Christian missions in New Zealand, also based in London, and similarly benevolent in their intentions, which arranged for it to be prepared and signed to protect Maori and their possessions, including their land, from unscrupulous Europeans by establishing British sovereignty over New Zealand. In other words, it derives its meaning from the place it occupies in the general history of the British Empire. Now, that traditional paradigm doesn't allow any agency to Maori in respect of the treaty other than to listen and to sign. For decades, that apparent lack was explained by saying that Maori understood what was going on and that apart from a few malcontents down the years, they've always known it was for their own good. They knew that because the missionaries told them so. As an overall paradigm, it rose from the underlying ideology which justified the British Empire to its creators and protagonists. When I went to school in the 1950s, we were taught that the British Empire was a positive and benevolent force in the world, which had brought civilization, culture and God to savages everywhere. The imperial authorities in London were doing this because it was their destiny to do so. Why them rather than the French, say? Well, the answer was because the British race, and that was the word that was used, and its civilization was superior to all others. You can laugh at that, but it was believed in by many otherwise intelligent and serious people over several centuries. To prove it, all classrooms were issued with a map of the world with the British bits coloured red. The Treaty of Waitangi was considered to be a long step in that process of civilising the savages. But as that empire began to vanish until it no longer exists, people began to question the paradigm upon which it was based, because it looked sillier and sillier when there was no empire. And over the last 30 years or so, voices have increasingly been raised calling that paradigm into question. Notwithstanding, it lingers on, and this still drives much of our thinking on the treaty, although that's rarely spelled out. This evening I'd like to suggest an alternative to it. Let's go to London in early 1839, where two men are having a meeting at the Colonial House. Who are they? Well, the first is a man called Constantine Phipps, who is better known to us as the Marquis of Normanby. He's the Colonial Secretary and a member of the governing cabinet of the day. The man he's talking to is a naval captain called William Hobson. Normanby is asked to see him because he has a job for him. Captain, by the way, is a fairly high rank in the Royal Navy, and Hobson had got there by his abilities. He was very experienced and was known to be a safe pair of hands. If he was good at a job, he did it. His previous posting, from which he just returned, was to what was known as the China Station, but that included not only the Asia-Pacific coast, but New South Wales, where Hobson had been posted most of the time for the last few years. In the course of that, he visited New Zealand, which was still then in international law, an independent country, and written a report on its affairs for the Governor of New South Wales, George Gipps. He was so impressed by it that he forwarded it to London. So when Normanby wanted someone to do a little job affecting New Zealand, Hobson, who by now was back in London, was the ideal man. Normanby wanted Hobson to go to New Zealand and negotiate a treaty with the indigenous inhabitants, under which they agreed to cede sovereignty over New Zealand to the British Crown. Hobson listened to what Normanby had to say and said to think about it. So the following day, Normanby, to help convince him, wrote him a letter, which we still have, a very interesting letter, setting out the terms of the task. And after a bit of to and fro, to clarify certain aspects of it, Hobson accepted the job and set off, calling first at Sydney for a few weeks for discussions with Governor Gipps and then on to New Zealand, arriving at the Bay of Islands in January 1840. How genuine was Normanby in seeking the consent of the Maori people as a basis for sovereignty? Well, the traditional interpretation says that he was entirely motivated by goodwill towards them. But when you look into the facts surrounding the lead-up to the treaty signing, however, that isn't quite so straightforward and in fact becomes ever so slightly questionable. The British government seems to have taken it for granted by its actions that it was going to be a done deal. Before Hobson even left England, whether the Maori agreed or not, and the government named him consul and prospective lieutenant governor over New Zealand in August 1839 on that assumption. When he does get here, there's an argument with Captain Niels that Hobson didn't command his ship, it was commanded by somebody else. He was a plenipotentiary, as to whether he ought to get a salute in his capacity as governor. And this is long before the treaty was signed. And his first action was to post a proclamation setting up a meeting with the local Maori in the house of the British resident James Busby for a week later, which he signs as if he has some sort of authority in New Zealand, which of course at that stage he didn't do so. But he has no text of any treaty that he's to ask the chiefs to sign. And so he spends the intervening week later with, drawing up a text with the assistance of the Reverend Henry Williams, who heads up the Church of England mission, and of James Busby, who for nearly a decade has been living in the Bay of Islands. So what were those two people doing there, and what were their credentials for doing what they were asked to do? Well, Busby has been set up there as the official British resident, as it was known, some years previously to send reports of affairs in New Zealand to the Colonial Office in London, because of the growing bad reputation of New Zealand as a bad, rough and lawless place in which quite a number of British citizens had taken up their abode or were visiting regularly for trade purposes and were misbehaving. This culminated in a nasty incident in which the brig Elizabeth, trading out of Sydney, had been used by the Ngāti Toa chief Te Whanganui-a-Tara to exact booty by way of a surprise attack on his enemies, Waitangi. The latter having been massacred and their Poko Araki tortured to death in captivity. The then Colonial Secretary Lord Goderich, when he heard of it, tried to have Captain Stewart, commanding the Elizabeth, and his first mate prosecuted for murder, because the law was clear that any crime under English law committed by British subjects was still a crime, even one committed outside English jurisdiction, and this was clearly accessory to murder. But for tangled reasons in New South Wales politics, Goderich could get no sense out of anybody in Sydney, and the two perpetrators, quote, disappeared, unquote, in mysterious circumstances before the prosecution could go ahead, which thoroughly exasperated Lord Goderich, and he arranged for the appointment of Busby to report regularly to the Colonial Office on New Zealand affairs. He was a bad choice. The authorities in Sydney didn't want him there, and so he had no soldiers available to him to enforce law and order. He also apparently had a very short fuse and would resort to bluster when nobody took him seriously. The Maori derisively named him the man of war without guns and laughed at his pretensions. To be fair, he did do some useful things, such as setting up a ruling council of Bay of Islands chiefs as the putative ruling body of an independent country called New Zealand, and establishing a ship registry, which was quite an important thing for the trading vessels now being built in New Zealand and trading into Australia. He also got the local chiefs to approve a mercantile flag as part of that process, which is still flown by some Maori at political events, you'll have seen it, and which is known as the flag of the United Tribes. He's also credited, by the way, with planting our first vineyard, but mostly he was politically completely impotent. Reverend Henry Williams was a different character altogether. You have to understand the history of the Church of England in the 18th century to understand what he was on about. During the 18th century, membership of the official Church of England, bear in mind it was the official church of the English nation, declined steeply between 1720 and 1800, while parallel membership in dissenting churches, that's to say unofficial Christian Protestant churches, rose at quite a steep rate. And to counter this, a reforming movement within the church called Methodism, led by John Wesley, developed and grew rapidly. Now, both the dissenters and the Methodists were zealous evangelicals who stressed the more radical messages of Christian justice. Both also expressed a fervent desire to bring the message of Christ to the heathen. The resultant missions in New Zealand had been established under the auspices of the Reverend Samuel Marsden in 1814, but by the beginning of the 1830s they were in a pretty sorry state, rent by internal dissension and backbiting and all sorts of curiosities, including the shooting by one group of missionaries of a horse belonging to another. This was not helped by the fact that all their efforts had, by 1830, yielded only 50 adherents and only 9 baptisms. So they weren't doing terribly well. And then quite suddenly, Māori began to seek conversion, literally in droves. They turned up in hundreds to be baptised. The missionaries thought this was a miracle from God, although we now know it actually meant that something much more interesting was happening. Māori, of course, as you may be aware, I hope, have their own sophisticated cosmology, and they didn't much care for Christianity and quite openly laughed at a religion that strung its own principal God up on a cross. So why did they suddenly start converting, in inverted commas, to Christianity? That was not, in fact, what they were doing. Their culture was highly flexible and adaptable, pragmatic, still is, which quickly fitted European technologies into their world. As soon as they saw whaleboats, for instance, they stopped making traditional canoes for everyday work and adopted the new version, which was easier to build and to navigate. The same with European agricultural techniques and especially with firearms. But although they could adapt their cosmology to these innovations up to a point, it eventually proved incapable of making sense of many European activities and ideas they wanted to incorporate into their own understanding of the world, and so almost en masse they adopted the European cosmology instead and adapted it to their ends. There's nothing strange about this, by the way. It's happened all over the Pacific for the same reason. In Melanesia and Polynesia and Micronesia, creating what are now known to anthropologists as cargo cults. And then, equally abruptly, about 1838, Maori converts began walking away from it. Similarly in large numbers, although they claimed still to be Christians and they respected the missionaries. The missionaries, on their part, were quite distraught. They couldn't understand what was happening. They didn't have the advantage of anthropological insight, which would have predicted this outcome after the adaptation had been made. So they blamed it on the presence and example of numerous Pākehā already living here, who were generally regarded in official and missionary circles as ruffians and scoundrels and an all-round bad lot. Who were these people? Well, let's go back to Normandy's letter to Hobson, because he talks about them. He says they were a body of persons not less than 2,000 of British subjects had become permanent inhabitants of New Zealand, that amongst them persons of bad and doubtful character, convicts who had fled from our penal settlements, seamen who had deserted their ships, and these people, unrestrained by any law and amenable to no tribunals, were alternatively authors and victims of every species of crime and outrage. Well, that was shocking. But was it true? And the answer to that, as so often in history, is yes and no. There's no doubt that quite a lot of people with no wish to renew their acquaintance with the law had ended up in New Zealand. Some were ex-convicts who had done a runner or ship's deserters. In both cases, given the conditions under which they had previously worked and lived, it's hard to blame them for buggering off. There's at least, but others have been recruited legally by contractors to work on New Zealand shore whaling stations where the work was similarly hard and often quite brutal. There's at least one case which ended up in front of the Sydney magistrates of a teenage boy being beaten to death by his employer in New Zealand for losing a whaleboat. The employer walked free, by the way. It's no surprise either to learn that things could get a bit boisterous when the whaling fleet was in and men starved of alcohol and female company enjoyed their first liberty ashore for as much as a year or even more. But not all of them behaved in that way. A number of the written accounts we have also record that some men on shore leave spent their Sundays attending church. Nor do all of those that found themselves living in New Zealand fit Normandy's pattern. The developing lively and thriving trade between Sydney and the Bay of Islands meant there was also a mixed population of timber workers, ship's carpenters, grog shop and accommodation keepers, and ship suppliers of provisions and equipment and so forth living ashore. These people made up the bulk of the people Normandy was referring to. Mostly they were quite respectable working folk who minded their own business and didn't want any trouble. They included many Māori and were the same sort of people as the later New Zealand immigrant working class, and they were there for the opportunities you always found in new settlements. This was a maritime frontier, no different to many others, that had long dotted the shores of South America, the West Indies and Madagascar, to name only the most significant areas. Such settlements governed themselves, owed nothing to the laws of the nations where they were located, and in some cases had been there for over a century. New Zealand was one of the more recent of these, and they were by no means lawless settlements. Edward Jerningham Wakefield, who was the son of the better-known Edward Gibbon Wakefield, records a visit to a shore whaling station in his book Adventure in New Zealand, which is still worth reading, by the way, very racy account, run as a sort of cooperative by the men themselves, which from his description sounds rather cosy and well set up. They were doing quite nicely. Others integrated themselves into the local iwi in one way or another, usually with local partners, both business and personal. It was often a much better life than their compatriots were being subjected to in Britain's burgeoning industrial cities. But the missionaries were scandalised by it, said they were debauching their converts, and demanded action from the Home Government. One is bound to remark that the demand for stricter law and order among the lower orders was not invented by the National Party last year. It has a long history. The interesting question is how this missionary view came to prevail and found its way into Normanby's instructions to Hobson. Well, that was simply because the missionaries had the ear of powerful and influential friends in London, and one in particular. Normanby didn't write Hobson's instructions himself. Officers of the Colonial Office did. And they were under the authority of its head, a man called James Stephen, who, by the way, was Virginia Woolf's great-grandfather. Stephen was not an evangelical Christian. He was, in fact, a Unitarian, but he was very influential and a friend of William Wilberforce, for example, with whom he had worked on the abolition of slavery. He was also well acquainted with a man called Danderson Coates, who was the head of the Church Missionary Society, who ran the large part of the missions in New Zealand. So it was the missionary version of events which drove official policy. Stephen privately expressed some scepticism about the wilder missionary claims, such as the numbers killed in the so-called musket wars, but he saw no reason to cause problems for himself by contradicting the missionaries, particularly so as there had been a major parliamentary inquiry into the treatment of the indigenous peoples of the British Empire just a few years previously. And this had led to the setting up of a body called the Aboriginals Protection Society, also under church missionary influence. So Hobson was sent on his way to establish sovereignty over New Zealand by way of the treaty. But as I said, he had almost no text. Instead, he was invited to confer with Governor Gipps when he got to New South Wales, and when he got to the Bay of Islands, he was to seek the assistance of the missionaries, which of course they were very glad to provide, although for their own reasons in some cases, as we'll see. The only thing his instructions specified was he must include in the treaty a provision that once sovereignty was established, Maori could only dispose of their land to the Crown at a price decided by the Crown. I'll talk about why that was there and why it alone was mentioned as a top priority shortly. But before I can do so, I have to introduce a new player into this little drama, a private commercial venture called the New Zealand Company. Now, quite a lot of people had taken a commercial interest in New Zealand and its possibilities over the previous several decades. The New Zealand Company had been set up in London in 1825, for example, and had tried unsuccessfully to get a royal charter granting it a monopoly to colonise this country. At the same time, the general view was that Britain was overpopulated, and a number of schemes had been proposed for dealing with this, but they all proved to be impossibly expensive. And then a man popped out of the woodwork with what seemed a plausible proposal under which emigration of surplus population not only cost nothing, but could actually make money. And his name was Edward Human Wakefield. Now, Wakefield has always been a controversial figure in our history. Some people regard him reverently as the father of his country. Others, such as myself, think he was a bit of a wide boy and a Maine chancellor who preferred abducting heiresses to working for a living. Although he ended up in Newgate prison because of it. He had snake oil to peddle in the form of this rather dodgy theory of immigration that he was spreading about. Either way, it interested quite a lot of people with money to invest. And the idea went something like this. It was well known that in official new settlements, the value of town land, usually sold as acre lots, appreciated rapidly in value. Wakefield said if you would get in at the outset and purchase the land in new colonies first from the indigenous owners at a cheap price, you could then sell it to incoming investors at a significantly higher price. You needed also, however, to import labour to do the work of development, which added value and set the land prices sufficiently high to ensure that it was investors and not the labourers who bought it. That required control under English law, and that in its turn required, funnily enough, the establishment of British sovereignty. The costs of this system and the profits of both the promoters and the investors would come from the difference in cost between the land acquired by the promoters from its indigenous owners and the costs they charged the investors to own it. It all looked very elegant on paper. But when it was tried in Western Australia at the Swan River settlement, that's where Perth is now, it didn't work. If you want to know the details of that, you should have a look at Karl Marx's analysis of why in the first volume of Capital. But the main flaw in the scheme was that the imported labourers could see no advantage to them in sweating it out in the sun to profit other people. So they stopped doing it and took ship to New South Wales, where the government gave them 50 acres of land free. So any subsequent scheme had to avoid that pitfall. So when it came to New Zealand, the company had to have a land monopoly, especially as some of the wealthier inhabitants in New South Wales, and in particular a man called William Charles Wentworth, were busy buying up the available land from any Māori they could get their hands on. So let's look again at the Crown preemption of purchase that Hobson was told to put in any treaty he negotiated. That would safeguard the company interests against the likes of Charles Wentworth, particularly as Normandy also announced that there was going to be a Land Claims Commission to deal with pre-treaty claims of purchase. One upshot of that was the company urgently dispatched a survey ship to New Zealand to buy up as much land from Māori as possible, so they had a case to argue before this body, which is known to history as the Old Land Claims Commission. I'll come back to that, but just note that the New Zealand company claimed subsequently to have made large purchases of land around Cook Strait in particular, but also in other places such as Nelson and the Taranaki. Unfortunately, they were a bit careless about who they thought they were buying it from, and an ancestor of mine had his life cut abruptly short as a result, but that's another story. They also sent out their first batch of settlers to Wellington before they knew if they even owned any land. They had promised these people. And Norman B was well aware of this was going on because he also referred to these settlers in his instructions to Hobson, adding weight to the suggestion that it was all cut and dry before Hobson left England. So let's go back a step and look at what happened in the event. Who wrote the treaty? Hobson had a secretary with him, and he largely did the scrivening, that's to say the copying out of the final text. But the actual text was composed by Busby, the resident, and the Reverend Henry Williams, both of whom were fluent in the Maori language. Henry Williams, as I said, was something of a tough customer. He was an ex-naval officer who brought the habits and manners of the quarterdeck to his charge as head of the mission, and who had sorted out the muddle into which it had descended. Both were very experienced and knowledgeable in matters to do with not just Maori language but Maori culture. They'd been living in the place for 10 years at least, had come to understand it to a degree. Their efforts created two principal texts, one in English and the other in Maori. But as you're probably aware, they don't say quite the same thing. The Maori text doesn't, for example, invite the chiefs to sign over their sovereignty in terms of their mana, which would have been the obvious appropriate word. And it doesn't say that because I'm sure Williams, who did the translation from the English draft, was well aware that the chiefs would never agree to sign up to that. Instead, he told them they were signing over their kāwanatanga, which was a much more vague concept. And he also told them they would retain their tino rangatiratanga, that's to say control of their own affairs and property, which seemed reassuring. The Maori version also contains what has come to be known as the preemption clause, but the wording used was, and I apologise for my accent because I'm not fluent in te reo, it says te hukona o irawahi whenua e pai e te tangata non a te whenua, which I'm advised, because as I said I don't speak te reo, doesn't mean that the Crown would have sole right of purchase. They would only have the first dibs, the right to make a first offer. If the Crown didn't want to buy them the right, if the Crown didn't want to buy, then the right of disposal of licence to reside on the land reverted to the Maori owners, as the latter understood what they were being offered as something to sign. I say reside because in Maori culture at that time, and since really, there's no concept of land alienation. You couldn't sell the land because it didn't belong to this generation to dispose of. It was a trust inherited from the tupuna and held on the same basis for successive generations. Well, of course, it would change hands through warfare or through marriage contracts or things of that sort. We have two contemporary unofficial accounts of events that happened on the day at Waitangi that we know of. These are in English. Now they have their own oral tradition of what happened on that day, but I'm not talking about that. One is by William Colenso, who was the mission printer, who wrote down notes at the time and got Busby to countersign them as an accurate account, although he didn't publish them until some decades later. The second is very interesting because it's hardly ever mentioned it at all. It also comes from quite an unexpected direction. During this period, an American flotilla under Lieutenant Wilkes was sailing around the Pacific region collecting natural history material, which subsequently formed the foundation of the Smithsonian Institution, and looking into American trade interests. And that flotilla happened to be in the Bay of Islands in February 1840, just by chance. And although Wilkes was not present at Waitangi, some of his other ship's officers may have been, and they certainly reported to him what had happened. And when the Major Chief Carpety came by on his return home, Wilkes accosted him and sat him down and got his version of events as well. I'll come back to Wilkes in due course because he says something very interesting about it in his subsequent publication. Meanwhile, at Waitangi, when the chiefs heard what was proposed, a few supported it, but most said, no thanks. What did they need a governor for? They were perfectly happy running their own affairs, and furthermore, they had grievances of their own. And at that point, there was a bit of a commotion from the local Pākehā inhabitants who had gathered to see the fun, quite an interesting event going on. One of whom said that Williams was not translating what was said properly, particularly in relation to the land. It was suggested that a local named Johnson should take over, but he said no thanks, he knew better. And Williams continued as before, with most chiefs telling the prospective governor to go back to England. And on that note, the first day ended with the distribution of tobacco and blankets. Nothing was supposed to happen the next day, but then Hobson got a report on his ship that some of the chiefs were going home complaining they hadn't got any blankets or tobacco. So he hurried ashore and reconvened the gathering for the actual signing. At that point, Colenso says he intervened. He said, "These people don't understand what they're being asked to sign." But Hobson got quite annoyed and said that he'd done his best to explain it and couldn't see what more was needed, and Colenso stepped back. But still nobody came forward until Williams called on the young chief Honeheke to come forward and ordered him to sign the treaty. And once he'd done that, others then followed suit. There were subsequent signings at other locations over the following months, mostly convened by the missionaries. Although when it came to the South Island, Hobson, who may have got sick of the process dragging on, declared that New Zealand was annexed by proclamation. Back to Lieutenant Wilkes, who also, from his interview with Kapiti, arrived at the same conclusion as Colenso. The signatories had no idea what they'd done, and they would regret it, he said. But he then went on to say something else, which is very interesting. He published a 7-volume account of his travel around the Pacific, by the way, and there's several pages about the signing of the treaty in it. He said, "The New Zealand Land Company has been the secret spring of this transaction. And it has been because of the influence of what he called the high names at the head of the company that the British government have been induced to go along with the proceeding." Well, why would he, and he said many others, think that? To find the answer, you had to go back to London and the relationship between the New Zealand Company and the British government of the day. I said earlier that an attempt to set up a chartered New Zealand company in 1825 failed. However, in 1838, a revived New Zealand Association came into existence, to be followed by a new New Zealand Company in 1839, which then got revised to a new form later the same year. Those ventures got a much more positive political response, because following an election in 1830 and the passage of a significant Reform Act in 1832, the Tory governments had been displaced from power after 50 years and replaced by weak, radical, liberal governments, much more amenable to colonial and commercial ventures beyond Britain. There was a very strong presence of this new political group among the promoters of the New Zealand ventures. Central to this was a man called John Lambton, who you may recognise as his name as the author of a street in Wellington, known to his friends as Radical Jack, whose control of a small number of members in the House of Commons ensured the government had a majority, so they owed him a big favour. He had been raised to the peerage in 1828 as Lord Durham and headed all 4 of the New Zealand oriented bodies that I've just mentioned. 3 of the original directors of the 1825 company were directors of both of the 1839 companies. Furthermore, were also directors of both the 2 companies of 1839 and the Association, while 9 more were directors of both companies. Most of the core group of people shared interests in shipping and maritime trade and insurance, and had previously invested in whaling and its related activities in the South Seas. There was nothing particularly remarkable about any of that. What is remarkable is the close association began then and successive governments in the 1830s. 20 of them had been Whig MPs at some point, and a number had held senior cabinet rank. One of their number, Sir William Molesworth, another street, was the company point man in the House of Commons and was to become the Colonial Secretary himself, some years later in the 1850s. In the light of this, the comments of Wilkes about the New Zealand Company being behind the treaty make considerable sense. If you then look into the activities of the old Land Claims Commission, more evidence of that connection comes to light. The main chair of the body was a man called William Spain, who was himself a protege of the Whig leadership in Britain, and known to be a safe pair of political hands. He and his fellow commissioners gave short shrift to most small pre-treaty claimants to land, those settlers who'd lived among Maori for some years in many cases, and even saw William Charles Wentworth off with a small compensatory grant of £200 while disallowing his claims. He claimed, by the way, to have bought the whole of North Island and half the South Island for £200. So they said, oh, well, okay, you can have your £200 back. But when it came to the company claims, they took a very different tack. Some of the claims they found valid, but even when they cast doubt on them, instead of returning the land to the previous Maori owners, they awarded it to the company claimants anyway, and paid the Maori owners compensation instead, whether they wanted it or not, and at a knockdown rate decided by them, not the Maori, not the owners. Some of those lands were then disposed of at a much higher price to individual colonists. Well, how could this be justified? Because the orthodox view of the day was that anybody who held land ownership collectively, that's to say tribally by way of an intergenerational inheritance and trust, which is how not only Maori but the majority of indigenous peoples around the world perceived their occupation of territories, by continuing to do so, was standing in the way of their advance to a state of civilization. This was best achieved by the commodification of land ownership and its vesting in legal individuals. The missionaries, people with a strongly protested interest of the Maori people at heart, largely endorsed this view, and mostly in good faith, saw divestment from Maori of their land as a step in the right direction, that's to say, their salvation and achievement of civilization. Thus, their almost universal subsequent advice to Maori to sign the treaty. The exception was the Roman Catholic mission, led by Bishop Pompalia, who cautioned Maori who sought his advice that they should not sign because they might regret doing so. Establishing sovereignty, and with it the advantages of civilization, may not have been the only missionary motive. Cynics among you might like to note that when the dust had settled, the Reverend Henry Williams, who I mentioned, had come into personal possession of 12,000 acres of land under legal title, and that he quickly gave up being a clergyman in favour of being a wealthy landowner, although he remained in holy orders. In so doing, he later built the basis in the Hawke's Bay in Canterbury of a family which today owns, through 800 direct descendants, more land than any other family in New Zealand. His actions at the time were regarded as sufficiently scandalous that in 1848 he was prosecuted in the courts by the then Governor Sir George Grey and his own Bishop, George Selwyn, for land grabbing. I'm sorry to say that the case was unsuccessful. So what is the result of what I've been saying? You may remember that we set out to invent the treaty. I hope you've noted that the one I have invented for you is not quite the same as the one you are usually taught about. You can draw your own conclusions about that. But when in 1843 Lord Stanley, the incoming Colonial Secretary in a new Tory government, encountered the treaty and asked what it was about, he was referred not to the Colonial Office officials, as you might expect, but to Sir Joseph Soames, again, name of Soames Island, who was now the chairman of the New Zealand Company following the death of Lord Durham. And Soames replied that the treaty was, and here I quote him, nothing but a praiseworthy device for amusing and pacifying savages for the moment. End of quote. It's hard to disagree with him because from the point of view of himself and his commercial and political friends, that's exactly what it was. But more importantly than that, it signals the beginning of a continuous and continuing period of international capitalist exploitation over our resources and people. More immediately, the land and its raw materials, more recently, our capacity to produce food efficiently for the world. Does that mean we should not honour the treaty because its proponents were acting in bad faith? Some would say they were crooks. Not in the least, although that's a separate but related matter which we're about to debate in this country, which is coincidentally, as I say, happening right now. But I will say this. Since its signing, the treaty has overseen every sort of political skullduggery and legal chicanery used to relieve the Maori people of their land and estate. The intention of the treaty was to, as loudly proclaimed in the official meta-narrative, both at the time and since, to protect Maori and their possession of their land, then it has been a miserable failure. Given that over the last 30 or so years that there has been a continuing attempt made to redress the grievous injustices entailed, it seems to me that honouring its promises is a very suitable or even ironic basis upon which we should go on doing it. That's all I have to say on the matter. But I'm open to argument and abuse. And at the end of that, I've also written a whole book about this subject called Before Hobson. It contains all of the research that underlies what I've been talking about. And if you want to obtain a copy, I'll sell you one at the trade price. $20.
Thank you very much. Tēnā te mihi ki a koe te rangatira e Tony, kua hora nei I tēnei kōrero o ngā kaipapa o te tiriti o Waitangi. Thank you very much for delivering that to us. That was very informative and very interesting. It casts some light on some characters. I think it seems like a very character-driven narrative, whom history has viewed in various ways over the years, and I think it interrogates some of those perspectives very nicely. I'm conscious we've all been sitting for a little while, so what I'd like to propose is that we go and grab a drink, maybe go to the wharepaku and reconvene in 5 minutes, and we'll have a bit of a question and answer with the man himself. I've got a few, so I'm going to get in the queue first, then it's all on you fellas. So go grab a drink, have a snack, go to the wharepaku, and we'll be back here in 5, eh?
Not to put too fine a point on it. And Lord Durham, in fact, was sent away to sort all that out. But the main player, from that point of view, was the guy I mentioned, James Steele. He was the permanent secretary of the Colonial Office, and he was hand in glove with the missionary interest. Now, that said, to me it became inconceivable in the end, having studied the treaty for a very long time and the surrounding material, that there would be an argument between the government of the day and the New Zealand company. Because, as I think I've shown fairly conclusively, they were the same people. Why would they argue with themselves in some fundamental way? But even more to the point, when I first read the treaty, and I was led to it by an article in New Zealand Journal of History back in the 1970s by a lady called Ruth Ross, who was one of the first people to conduct a detailed textual analysis of it, which has been enormously important, by the way, since, was to say to myself, what the hell is this clause about exclusive right to sale? I couldn't understand what it was doing there, because it seemed to make no sense. And until I read Marx on the subject, it suddenly clicked. I said, hello, that's there to avoid the failure of this settlement, as happened in the question of the Swan River, which was also a Wakefield settlement. They realised that you had to have pretty tight control over who could get their hands on land. In Australia, of course, as I said, you could just nip around the corner to New South Wales if you were a labourer, and they give you 50 acres, provided you prepared to farm it and all the rest. In New Zealand, that would be a different matter, because there was nowhere easy to go to get hold of land if the government had sole right of purchase. And somebody should go through the old Claims Commission papers. Nobody ever has. I've had a brief run through. They're in the archives here. And they're a very interesting group. They fall into several groups. If you were a guy who was here before 1840 and you were in a small way in the whaling industry or milling a bit of timber or something and earning a living, you got short shrift from the old Land Claims Commission. But if you were a large claimant, such as the New Zealand company, you were treated very, very favourably. And it wasn't just a question of size, because most people in New Zealand had never heard of William Charles Wentworth, but they should have. He was the roughest, toughest capitalist in New South Wales, and totally ruthless. The reason why they could never get anybody to prosecute the ship Elizabeth's captain and mate was because the ship belonged to William Charles Wentworth. And he made it clear that anybody who prosecuted in the courts, that would be the end of their legal career in New South Wales. And everybody took the hint and nobody did. So there were some big noises available. But the New Zealand company were the ones who had the clout. And it seemed to me, I mean, I'm a believer in the theory of analysis, that some of you may have come across, called Occam's razor, which was actually developed, funnily enough, by a medieval monk called William of Ockham. But what he said was, if you have a set of facts and you're trying to work out what they mean, probably the simplest explanation that fits them all is the most accurate one. As I say, it's called Occam's razor. And in my view, the traditional interpretation that we have, the traditional paradigm, does not fit all the facts. You can't fit facts in. And that's why Wilkes, in my view, never gets a mention. Nobody talks much about what Pompallier had to say, and so on, and so on.
That's a quick question, just for information. But presumably there wasn't a landowning class, or say, any aspect of feudalism that the Maori culture would understand. For the British people who come in to negotiate with the Maori, for instance, you know, in India they look for landowners. It's a landowning class they can negotiate the sale of the land or even the seizure of the land. In Maori culture, society, was there a land, you know, an aristocracy?
There was a ruling group, but it was not a landed aristocracy. Land was owned communally, and that was the difficulty. And not just by this generation, but all past generations and all generations to come. And that was to cause all sorts of trouble in the 1860s when Maori stopped agreeing to sell their land. But forget about that for a moment. When Busby set up the United Tribes, he simply selected a whole group of leading rangatira from the Bay of Islands area and set them down and got them to make a declaration of sovereignty. I think 1836, as I recall. 35, okay. He did it for two reasons, primarily. The first was a very strange reason. There was a French aristocrat called the Baron de Thierry wandering about in New Zealand at the time, and he claimed to be king of the United Tribes of New Zealand. And he was making a nuisance of himself, and Busby thought he'd put a stop to that, which he did, in effect, by getting the chiefs to say no. We're our own chiefs, and that man's nothing to do with it. The other was a much more important one, and that was, you may be aware that in maritime law, unless your vessel is registered with a ship's registry, it does not exist as a ship. And ships were being built in New Zealand and sailed across the Tasman as trade vessels, taking agricultural produce. There was a big trade in potatoes, for example. And because they were not registered with any particular ship's registry, they were no more in law than what's known as flotsam and jetsam. And therefore anybody could walk on board them and say, this now belongs to me. It's just a bunch of junk floating on the sea. But if it's registered with the ship's registry, then you can't do that. And to do that requires a flag. And that's where the flag of the United Tribes came from. Right. But it now serves a much broader political purpose in the view of many Maori.
Thank you for that. So you really feel that 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 preemption clause in the treaty really served to muscle out the little guy and facilitate purchase by larger entities, primarily New Zealand companies. Is that your...
Yes, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And once you start to look at all the facts, it's hard to arrive to any other conclusion. I think Wilkes was quite right in what he said.
So,
as was Sir Joseph Soames, who said this is just a device for pacifying savages. And that's how he saw it. And from his point of view, he was quite right. The important thing to remember is that the traditional historiography says that the Crown entered into the treaty in good faith. And I say bullshit. From the very outset, the intention was to get hands on the land on the part of a significant group of British South Seas investors in the City of London. There's a very interesting book just been published, some of you may have come across, by a guy called Ben Fletcher, which is an analysis of the, it's actually called the English text of the Treaty of Waitangi. And it's been widely praised, and it is, it deserves it for one reason, or a couple of reasons. One of which, of course, is that it's one of the most comprehensive pieces of research as I've ever read, which it ought to be because it's 800 pages long, and I've read it twice, so I'm lucky to be here with you this evening. It has drilled down deeper into the files of the Colonial Office and the Church Missionary Society far more than anybody else ever has. It's a very good piece of research from that point of view. Secondly, it contains the ultimate truth that if you want to know what the treaty was about in its context, the answer is in London. Unfortunately, its paradigm, in my view, is rubbish, because it proceeds on the assumption that the Crown, the missionaries, the Colonial Office and everybody proceeded in good faith. And I don't think they did. I think the opposite was the case. And to me, the proof of that is that once the treaty was signed, there's no evidence of any moves being made by first the Crown Colony Government and later by the Colonial Government to protect Maori interests in land. On the contrary, they moved as fast as they possibly could to get as much of it out of Maori hands and into colonial settler hands as they possibly could. And that tells you quite a lot about what it was actually all about.
Indeed. All right, one more from me before we open it up to the floor a little bit more. So, you talk about this idea of introducing the idea of a property ownership concept amongst Māori and existing here prior to thing, and that being a motivation. It seems as if it kind of ties into that maybe Hobbesian or Lockean view of the development of the savage being the emergence of private property and that being a kind of a driving force. Do you think that was an ideology that was influential at the time in that? Do you think people saw the introduction of private property as part of a civilizing process?
Oh, it was absolutely fundamental in thinking at the time. If you study European history in the colonising centuries, you eventually, or quite quickly, come across something called the problem of the savage. People going out and exploring the world encountered groups of people with highly developed civilizations, particularly in Southern America, who owed nothing whatsoever to the God of the Israelites, and who had a very advanced and sophisticated civilization. How was that to be fitted into the historiography of the Old Testament? Well, in the end, people decided you couldn't, and so they developed the beginnings of anthropology as part of what's known as the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. For some reason, Edinburgh became a centre, an intellectual centre, and produced people like Adam Smith and others. And it produced a man called Macpherson. He was the one who invented a hierarchy of civilizations, beginning with hunter-gatherers and ending with cities and large nations and so on. And he saw the basis of that as the moment at which civilization began was when you switched to private ownership of land and private property. People at the time were not all impressed by it. Somebody described it as an account of how people moved from being a primitive savage to being a Scotsman. Unkind to the Scots.
Very good.
But a very important concept.
Yeah, of course.
Very important.
Yeah, I think that is, that influence of the Scottish Enlightenment thing is on colonial theory is fascinating.
If you read further into New Zealand colonial history, you keep encountering speeches by politicians in which they refer to something they call, and I'm quoting them, beastly communism. And what they mean is communal ownership of land. And their intention was to end it as quickly as possible. But for the good of the indigenous people, of course.
Very good. All right, let's open it up to the floor. Does anyone have any burning questions? Please just shoot your hand up. If there are any, if I'm missing you, wait it out. Yes, there's one. So.
Hey, kia ora. Thank you very much for elucidating some really important things. I was just wondering, in terms of the Catholics at the time, you mentioned Pākehā, do you think there were groups that would try to work constructively with Māori and in accordance with tikanga and not necessarily the capitalistic view, the deviation?
So just for those at the back who may not have heard that, the question was, in terms of the Catholics who were there at the time operating as missionaries, was there a more good faith effort to integrate with Māori and operate by tikanga, etc.? That was the question.
I don't think that was what was driving Pākehā and the Catholic mission. If you're familiar with Colenso's account, you'll know that Pākehā turned up in his full canonicals on the first day of the discussions on the treaty, and to the outrage of the Protestant missionaries, marched straight into the house where Hobson was meeting with various people, and they were scandalised. They said, "What's he doing talking to that heathen man?" What he was actually on about was seeking an assurance that under British sovereignty, and unlike in Britain itself, there was to be no established official religion. And Hobson gave him that assurance. He said, "No, we're not going to establish the Church of England in New Zealand, as it is in Britain." And Pākehā, having satisfied himself on that point, then left. But he saw his task as bringing Māori people to Christ within the Catholic faith. But he would not, of course, have regarded that as favourable to tikanga. He would not have liked that. He might even have regarded that as a form of devil worship. But the Protestant missionaries were very indignant about the Catholics because they said they allowed Māori to convert too easily. It had to be a process of struggle in which you came to Christ in your heart. And the Catholics didn't bother with all that stuff. That wasn't part of their deal.
Interesting. Thank you for that question. The Pākehā law? Oh, there's one over there.
You said something about because of all this, capitalist influence onto the treaty, the English translation. You said then maybe how do we put honour into that? Wouldn't that just kind of mean that the Māori text is that much more important and should be that much more privileged? And what would you think the process to do that? Because for me, that whole entire talk just legitimised the fact that the English translation is bullshit. And that we should forget about it and perhaps maybe find a way to privilege and also acknowledge and probably put into some sort of constitutional law the Māori text. What's your thoughts on that?
So the question for those in the back was, given all these problems and some of the motivations behind the construction of this English text, do you not feel maybe that gives the text in Te Reo even more legitimacy and could serve as even more of a basis for constitutional reform in this country?
In strict international law, the Maori version of the treaty is the official version.
Yes, under the UN.
But, yes, But the trick is to try and implement that within a real state, like New Zealand. And the difficulties associated with trying to do that have become very obvious in the last few months, because there are a group of people who don't want that to happen. And unfortunately they happen to have a serious influence on the government here at present. And I'm looking forward, in a way, to the debates that are going to break out when the new legislation is published. Because in my view, there's no question about what the treaty means. You don't need a new exegesis. But there are an awful lot of people around who say, this treaty business has gone far enough. But what we're doing at present, step by slow step, is to try and redress the balance and implement the treaty as it stands in the Maori language. But it's a fraught process, and we've more or less come to the end, in some ways, of the available room for manoeuvre. And I can't, myself personally, see it going forward much without quite a big debate and quite an angry one. Some years ago, when I was, for my sins, working as a strategic planner in government, I was in the Customs Department, and they said to me, can you do a series of seminars for us, because the state services legislation now requires our people to be cognizant of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And I said, oh yes, I'll give that a run. And so I developed a seminar program, and a lot of it was to do with discussion and talking to people about the sorts of things, but in a broader compass, that I've been talking about this evening. And I'll never forget at the end of one elderly customs officer saying to me, in exasperation, well, when is this treaty business going to end? And me saying to him, well, I've got bad news for you.
All right, we've got about 10 more minutes, so I reckon maybe 2 or 3 more papa, and then we might have to knock it on the head for the evening. Did I see one from over here before? No?
Not yet.
Any others? Any more for any more? Yep, send.
Yeah, so I guess touching on how you talk about how there's a mass conversion, well, not compared to a mass conversion of Māori people when they started creating bad relationships with the missionaries. Was that driven by, as you mentioned, an interest in the sort of culture of the wide world, or was it more sort of pragmatic and trying to improve access to technology and relationships with the sort of emerging British business in New Zealand?
So sorry, I should repeat that. So the question for this debate was that mass conversion of Māori to Christianity that was mentioned in here. What were the drivers of that? Was that more of a pragmatic thing, or was it for an interest in the religion itself in the wider world?
One of the most important and interesting things about Maori culture is, in my estimation, it's one of the most sophisticated and pragmatic and adaptable and flexible cultures in the world. It had to be because it brought people right across the South Pacific from a tropical area to a temperate area where they established settlements with their culture on very sophisticated navigation and vessels, and so they always were able to adapt. They adapted very quickly to the food resources that were available here that were unknown to them. They developed new methods of building and working both timber and stone, and as soon as people hove into sight who had better things to offer, they very quickly adapted to those. But there's a limitation to that process. People understand the meaning of things because they fit them in to the cosmology that they already have. And eventually, the existing Maori cosmology was unable to cope with all of the adaptations that needed to be made. And so by picking up on aspects of the European cosmology, which they did via the biblical stories of the missionaries, they were able to continue that process of adaptation and development. I think it's an extraordinary achievement quite remarkable. In many other parts of the world, of course, the eruption of Europeans into their backyard has just meant the end of it. But not in the case of the Māori. I mean, that's amazing. And so I don't think that what was happening meant that they all became good little Christians. They had other motives. And it's partly what I meant when I said that the traditional interpretation does not allow any agency to Maori people. We can't quite accept that they had their own view of what was going on, and it was a legitimate view, and a very sophisticated one.
All right, thank you for that.
First of all, thank you very much again for speaking with us tonight. Just thinking again, sort of bringing it back to sort of historicising the present a little bit, do we feel or do we think that the present kind of renegotiation or discussion around Te Tiriti right now is a continuation of the Crown's kind of original meaning or intentionality, or do we think it's something different?
So the question, for those who can't see Walter Benjamin in the striped shirt over there, ooh, lots of anthropologists in the room, thanks for that one. Like that laugh. The question was, do you think the historicising of correction, the rehistoricising of the treaty in the present, you know, I'm trying to ask the question.
The people who are asking us to rethink the principles of the treaty are people who don't actually accept that what we've achieved in the last 30 or 40 years has been a legitimate activity. They have a traditional view of the treaty which has a paradigm which is right out of Rudyard Kipling. It's all to do with the white man's burden. And they've reached the point where they are now in a position of some power. That's what I say when I say that David Seymour is a cynical manipulator, where they think they can abandon what has been achieved. When is this treaty business coming to an end? Well, we're going to put an end to it. I don't think they will be successful. But what I'm afraid of is that it will lead to enormous uproar and even violence. I mean, we are a society capable of violence when we disagree. Everybody who lived through the 81 tour knows perfectly well. And I would not personally like to see those days come again.
All right.
I think David Seymour's playing with fire.
All right, I think we'll leave it there. We'll linger for a little while if you want to have some corridor after the session. Once again, thank you to the Rogue and to Bedlam Squalor for hosting us. Thank you to the Society. Thank you to you, Tony. And thank you to everyone for coming along tonight to listen. Grab a copy of the Commonweal up there by the bucket if you'd like. Drop some putia into that same bucket if you really like. And thank you very much for attending. Kia ora.
Sure.